Good afternoon. My name is Ganiyat Sadiq, and I'm the Advocacy Officer for Justice for All Canada, a human rights organization focused on global genocide prevention. Thank you for joining us today as we mark the United Nations International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered here on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. This day is about standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people, who have endured decades of displacement, ongoing occupation, and systemic violence. Today, we remember the profound and ongoing injustices that the Palestinian people face. For Canada, this day is an opportunity to demonstrate true leadership by aligning our policies with the principles of justice, human rights, and international law. Palestinian statehood is a legal fact. The State of Palestine has been recognized by 146 out of 193 United Nations member states. Our allies, including Spain, Norway, and Ireland, have also recognized Palestine. Yet Canada remains one of the few countries that has not taken this step. This lack of recognition isolates us globally and sends a troubling message that Canada does not fully support Palestinian self-determination and equality under international law. Palestinian statehood is supported by international law, yet Canada's decision to formally recognize the state continues to be political. Recognition of Palestinian statehood is an acknowledgement of an inalienable right. Palestinians have a deep historical and cultural presence in the region, yet they have faced apartheid policies that undermine their right of self-determination. Palestinians, like all people, deserve to have their own state, their own government, and their own future, free from occupation and oppression. The Canadian government continues to support a two-state solution. However, this position is inherently contradictory if we refuse to recognize Palestine as a state. How can Canada genuinely advocate for a two-state solution while denying recognition to one of those parties? Negotiating a two-state solution is impossible if one of those states is not acknowledged. The human cost of inaction is evident. Since 2023, over 41,000 Palestinians have been killed, with tens and thousands more injured and millions displaced. Entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble due to the relentless airstrikes and blockades. For every day that Canada delays recognizing Palestine, more lives are lost and the suffering continues. The international community's commitment to human rights and humanitarian law demands that Canada responds. The escalating humanitarian crisis in Gaza is a direct consequence of the lack of accountability. As a signatory of the Genocide Convention, Canada has the responsibility to act in the face of these atrocities. Recognizing Palestine would empower its people to seek recourse in international forums and strengthen our collective commitment to preventing further loss of life. Today, on the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People, we call on the Canadian government to fully recognize the State of Palestine. We ask our leaders to choose courage over complacency. Canada can either affirm its commitment to human rights by recognizing Palestine or continue enabling a status quo that perpetuates systemic abuses and denies an entire people of their right to peace and dignity. Thank you for being here today, and I would like to introduce our first speaker, Gabrielle Fayant, who is the co-founder of the Assembly of Seven Generations, an Indigenous nonprofit youth-led organization.
Tanse, Gabrielle Fayant, Nitsigason, Pukjahanse Otsinia. I want to acknowledge that Ottawa, what Canada calls its nation's capital, is located on the occupied territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. The land that we stand on today was never won in a war, bought, or sold. Treaties were not made here, and the Indigenous peoples who call this land their home were forced into relocation. The very brick and mortar of the Parliament buildings contain artifacts and the bones of the Algonquin people. This is just one example of the violent ways Canada was created through settler colonialism, which has such strong parallels to what we are witnessing today in Gaza. As Indigenous peoples, we have a responsibility to stand up and mobilize because of our ancestors who survived Canada's violent colonization. To those who cannot see the parallels between Canada and Israel, Learn to understand that to justify these ongoing colonial projects, settler states must rely on one another to push for the normalization of violent acts through policy, legislation, and media. In Canada's short history as a country, multiple acts of genocide have been forced onto Indigenous peoples of this land. Some of those forced forms of policy include forced relocation onto reserves, forced sterilization, mass incarceration, systemic racism that has caused overrepresentation of Indigenous children and child welfare, and an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, as well as the legacy of the residential schools in which mass graves have been uncovered, and generations of trauma has affected almost every Indigenous person alive today in Canada. Our cultures and our ceremonies were made illegal. It was even illegal to leave the reserve, to seek out lawyers, to seek mediation for our injustices. It was also made illegal to fight back against the theft of our children who were forced to attend residential schools, and where many met horrible conditions and many were murdered. As Indigenous people who are resisting and surviving settler colonialism here in our homelands, we are showing up today in solidarity with Palestine because we know that our liberation cannot be complete without the liberation of Palestine. Yesterday's colonizers will not condemn today's colonizers. However, it is up to us, the people, to continue to put pressure, which is the least we can do, while Palestinians have been and continue to experience a mass genocide in their homelands. Canadians were shocked when they learned about the mass graves of Indigenous children at residential schools. However, it was well documented that Canadians knew about the conditions at the schools for decades. For far too long, Canadians have had the privilege to turn away while also reaping the benefits of removing Indigenous peoples from our homelands. Canada can no longer continue to turn a blind eye and pretend that these experiences aren't happening. Canada can no longer remain comfortable in times of injustice. Canada has a responsibility to intervene and disrupt settler colonialism when it is happening in real time. And we call upon all Canadians to stand up in these moments of injustice and really step into your human beings and humanity. The world needs it right now. Exe, hi, hi.
Thank you, Gabrielle. I would now like to call up Monalisa Ghadban, a proud Palestinian Canadian and a lifelong human rights activist, speaker, and advocate. She is the co-founder and one of the creative directors of Film for Palestine, a grassroots initiative focused on raising awareness and fostering dialogue in the community about film, occupation, and Palestinian life.
Okay, I'll just get right into it. Today is the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People. It's surreal that over the last 400 days we've witnessed the genocide in Gaza and increased settler violence in the West Bank, while our government officials and ministers state that the situation is complex or complicated, or they've done all they could in regards to the matter. There is nothing complex when the evidence the evidence of violence against Palestinians is staggering. It's visible on social media, through many non-entity-owned news and media outlets. The Lancet published a study titled "Counting the Dead in Gaza, Difficult but Essential" in July 2024, stating that over 180,000 Palestinians have been martyred, and this is a conservative estimate. I could talk about the numerous reports from Oxfam, UN commissions, Human Rights Watches, Doctors Without Borders, or the verdicts from the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice over the last year. And without fail, all will say that Gaza, West Bank, all the Palestinians in Greater Palestine are being starved, butchered, maimed, tortured, assaulted, imprisoned, while living in horrifying conditions. There is no discernment between young, old, man, woman. It's just senseless violence by the occupational forces. Canada has failed its role as an international actor in its due diligence in not complying with the ICC and ICJ rulings. Canada's lack of critical humanitarian response to the Palestinian people, its continued weapon sales, and not implementing a two-way arms embargo with Israel is a direct reflection of political policy, not security. This point is furthered by CJMP Alex Patterson, who last week explained Canada's policies around Palestinians' temporary resident visa, the TRVs, are rooted in anti-Palestinian racism and are restrictive for all parties involved. If Canada really wanted to take necessary steps by now, it would acknowledge Palestine's existence as a state and as a world member, noting that over 146 countries have recognized Palestine as a sovereign state. Still, our government officials and ministers will discuss a Palestinian state's legitimacy to exist, its deserving aid or relief. Now more than ever, we need our government to end its complicity in Israel's ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people, to take action ending Israel's genocidal systems of occupation, oppression, and apartheid by boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning the occupying state and its actors. Our demonstrations every week are a response to witnessing the lack of aid, relief, and action from Canada. We are witnessing our collective Palestinian culture and heritage completely being wiped from human existence. Palestinian Muslim, Jews, and Christians gone from family registries, while the occupation uses Canadian parts in the war machines, leaving Canada not only complicit in aiding the genocide in Gaza, but also actively participating in the annexation of another Indigenous community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monalisa. I would now like to introduce Dr. Yipeng Ge, a primary care physician and public health practitioner based on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquish Anishinaabe. He has worked on and studied the structural and colonial determinants of health in both settler colonial contexts, such as so-called Canada and occupied Palestine.
Good afternoon. I first learned about allyship and solidarity work when I learned about the genocide of Indigenous peoples here on occupied Turtle Island from First Nations, Haudenosaunee scholars, and community members. Today, I am speaking from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. Canada, as a settler colonial state, is made up of broken treaty lands and stolen lands from Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. For me, spending time with Indigenous communities, whether it be at Six Nations of the Grand River or in Nunavut in the north, I learned from Indigenous communities that resistance to colonial violence and erasure takes many forms. Resistance in Palestine by Palestinians against genocidal colonial violence and erasure also takes many forms. Not only is resistance the deepest form of love, but is rooted in preservation of dignity, life, care, and ultimately justice. Palestinians as Indigenous peoples to their lands, which have been occupied for decades and generations since and before the ongoing Nakba, or catastrophe, began in 1948, find themselves resisting colonization and extermination because it is the necessary thing to do to protect and preserve their people and their community on their traditional lands. As a non-Palestinian, I am so privileged and grateful to have visited Palestine and to have shared many beautiful memories with amazing people from all over Palestine. I have fond memories of visiting places in Palestine, like Nablus in the West Bank, to try their famous kanafe, a traditional pastry dessert made with cheese soaked in syrup and topped with pistachios. Or hiking in Batir, walking amongst a landscape of olive trees, grapevines, stone terraces, flowers, and poppies. Learning about the agricultural irrigation system as one of the oldest farming methods and remains a source of livelihood for local Palestinian communities. Or watching a dabke performance and later also attempting to learn a bit of dabke, which is a traditional Palestinian dance. I have learned from Indigenous communities here on Turtle Island and from Palestinians in Palestine that your stories, your histories, your food, your art, your music, your dance, your culture, your language, your joy, they are all forms of resistance against colonial violence and erasure. One of the most pertinent examples I will leave you with was from my time in Gaza earlier this year during this ongoing overt genocide. There were a handful of occasions where I saw kites being flown by children. These kites varied in their construction. Some kites appeared to have been made by materials like plastic or garbage bags, but they worked well and they were beautiful to see flying in the sky. Upon a backdrop of drones, quadricopters, fighter jets, and ongoing bombing, to see a kite in the sky now and then showed me the steadfastness of the Palestinian people and the children that I simply can't put into words. The only hot meals I ate in Gaza or because the Palestinian healthcare workers demanded that we share meals together. Knowing they had so little, they still wanted to do more for us as their guests. I left my heart in Gaza. I realize this is a love letter to Palestine. Ultimately, Palestinians in Palestine will free and liberate themselves through their resistance efforts on the ground. But that does not absolve us from the moral obligation and legal responsibility to end Canada's complicity, support, and active involvement in Israel's ongoing genocide and apartheid of the Palestinian people. We have a duty to the Palestinian people through meaningful, intersectional, and unwavering solidarity to do what we can from where we are to support their efforts towards self-determination and liberation. We must see a recognition of a Palestinian state. We must see a permanent two-way arms embargo with Israel. We must see Canada comply with all of the ICJ rulings and the ICC arrest warrants. This includes Canadian companies and institutions enacting all necessary and appropriate divestments from Israel. And as individuals and as collectives, we must support boycott campaigns for companies complicit in Israeli apartheid, occupation, and genocide. We must see unrestricted humanitarian aid for Gaza. We must see Gaza be rebuilt. We must see reparations for Palestinians, and we must see an end to the legal Israeli occupation of Palestine. We will see, within our lifetimes, Palestinians living free and with their right of return honored and fulfilled. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yipeng. I would now like to introduce our final speaker, Sam Hersh, a community and political organizer and an active member of the Ottawa chapter of the Independent Jewish Voices.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Sam Hersh, and I am here as a representative of the Ottawa chapter of Independent Jewish Voices. Independent Jewish Voices is a national organization with over 24 active chapters in cities and on university campuses from coast to coast. We are a group of Jews in Canada from diverse backgrounds, occupations, and affiliations who share a strong commitment to social justice and universal human rights. We come together in the belief that the broad spectrum of opinion among the Jewish population of this country is not reflected by those institutions that claim to represent Jewish communities as a whole. As we gather here today on the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People, it bears emphasizing that the Palestinians are facing what has now been widely deemed a genocide in Gaza. And here in Canada, times are dark as well. We are facing a deep repression of our rights to free speech and protest, and backlash for even showing any solidarity at all with those facing the brunt of the Israeli government's bombardment. Just this past week in Ottawa, 6 were violently arrested for protesting peacefully, despite following the same route and following all the rules that authorities set for them week in and week out. Despite these violent events, earlier this week, a representative of CIJA stood on this very stage and called for a greater police response towards those who continued to demonstrate day in and day out, and insinuated, without any evidence, that rallies, quote, embolden extremists and are hateful outright. Many of us on this stage and in this movement, including Jews, have been to these rallies in the past 13 months. We have felt and continue to feel welcomed, and our deep sense of solidarity that we feel at those rallies is what brings us all here today, despite what groups like CIJA might say or purport to represent. For far too long, successive Canadian governments have repeated Canada's foreign policy position of supporting a two-state solution while neglecting to take virtually any meaningful action to attain this objective. Just this fall, in September, for example, permanent representative to the UN, Bob Rae, abstained from a vote supporting the creation of an independent Palestinian state, despite this being long-held Canadian foreign policy. Canada has also done little to nothing to stop the growth of illegal settlements, which it purports to oppose in this official policy. These settlements are one of the main obstacles to a Palestinian state, but also peace overall in the region. Not only is Canada's lack of action in the issue, but our state and government, as others have mentioned today, is actively engaging in complicity, for example, in trade with these settlements, as it continues to support a free trade agreement that does not differentiate between settlements and Israel proper, allowing settlements to benefit from the Canadian market. Our government has also allowed Canadians to receive tax benefits through supporting charities that support and fund the activities of the IDF and often violent settler organizations. It's time for Canada to change course, and we believe that Canada's recognition of a Palestinian state would constitute an important step towards actualizing the right of Palestinians to self-determination, which Canada acknowledges and which we support. But it cannot stop there. Recognizing Palestinian statehood alone, without taking steps to end our complicity and to apply pressure on Israel, would not be anywhere near enough. If Canada is truly serious, it must take real action, such as imposing sanctions on higher-ranking individuals in Israel who are directly responsible for the ongoing genocide, not just low-level actors. The government must also reject its adoption of the anti-Palestinian IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, including the handbook it released earlier this month, due to its perversion of the important fight against anti-Semitism and its role in chilling important efforts for Palestinian human rights at this critical juncture. The government must also commit to a full arms embargo and resist pressure from the pro-Israel lobby to change course on the ICC ruling on Netanyahu and Gallant. Recognition of a state is important, but real movement on this issue cannot move forward without real material pressure. Thank you.
Thank you. To close, we call on the Canadian government to formally recognize the state of Palestine. Justice for All Canada urges the Canadian government to extend immediate and formal recognition. And we also call for the implementation of a comprehensive arms embargo to prevent Canadian arms from being used in humanitarian law violations. This must include closing loopholes that allow the transfer of military equipment deemed non-lethal to Israel and unregulated arms transfers via the United States. Thank you, and we'll accept any questions if there's any.
If you're on Zoom and have a question, please use the raise hand function. Pour les journalistes en ligne, si vous avez une question, s'il vous plaît, utilisez la fonction main levée. Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci, c'est ce qui conclut la conférence.